Y'all, welcome back to the Making Motherhood Magical podcast. I am your host, Jamie Mae Bright, and I am excited to be coming back to you this week with episode number 8. This episode, heads up, warning, trigger warning right now. It's all about the magical gift of grief. So, we're going to be talking a lot about grief, a lot about loss, a lot about just all of that. So, first off, if that is something that's triggering for you, please know that that is what today's episode is about, and decide with how your mental wellness is, whether or not that's something that you would want to participate in listening to today. And so, anyway, if you are listening and at any point you feel like you need to reach out and talk to someone, the crisis text line, you just text the word home, HOME, to 741-741. So write that down. Text home to 741-741. If for any reason you need to talk to anybody, that is the crisis text line. And there is no shame in reaching out. Plus, how much easier is it to reach out in text form rather than calling some 800 numbers? So don't be afraid to use it. Write it down. Share it with your friends. It's a good thing. So today's about grief. But before we get into grief, I would like to start with this week's magic moment. This past week, I did a workshop through Hay House. That was a free workshop or seminar, whatever you want to call it. It was by Dr. Mindy Pelz. And this is her book, Fast Like a Girl. If you haven't read it, you should get it. It's on Audible, but it's also really affordable through Hay House. And I highly, highly suggest having a copy of it. I have all kinds of stuff written in mine. I'm a book writer, so yeah, I like to write my books. But I had pulled this out because I was wanting to refresh a couple of things that we were going over in the workshop. And I had already known I was going to be working on an episode with grief. I had already started kind of giving outlines and all of that. And out of this book, which, mind you, I would like to say I bought in October of 2023. And so it's a new book. It's not like a book that's been sitting around for a long time. And out of it fell 2 pictures. So if you're watching on Spotify or YouTube, you can see the pictures. If not, I'll try to describe them. But the first picture that fell out was a picture of my mom and my dad on their wedding day with my nanny and my pawpaw. And of all of the people that I've had in my life that I have lost, I miss these 4 the most definitely, especially this lady right here. My nanny, I was her baby. I miss my nanny a lot. But there was no sense to these old pictures. I mean, these were printed in the 80s. These are like, curled up old photographs. These are not like printed out on paper. These are legit, Fox developing Kodak film pictures. And they fell out of this book. I don't know why they were in this book. I don't know how they got in this book. This book, I didn't use them for a bookmark in this book. I actually used the little leaf things in the book for a bookmark when I read this book. So I don't know why they were here, but it made me know that I definitely had to do this episode about grief because the people that I grieve the most jumped out right here. And I just knew that they were with me. I knew that this was something important to talk about. So I hope that as we go through today's episode, that everyone gets something out of it, because there's a lot behind grief, and we all grieve different things in different ways. So like I said, this was my sign that this is the right episode for right now. And the second picture that came out was a picture of me. That's baby Jamie right there. That's before Amanda was here. So this was before my youngest sister was born. So probably very close to, if not right before this day. And that's my brother Frank. That's my sister Rose. That's my brother Jason. And that is my cousin Dory. But the reason that this picture makes me grieve is not because of who's in the picture. It's because of 2 things. One, I don't know if you can tell, but this was in the back of my dad's Volkswagen bus. And holy cow, do I grieve him getting rid of that bus. I would give anything to have the bus that he had when mom and him met. And I grieve the fact that this bus is no longer in my life. I also, on one level, grieve the fact that I'm not the baby anymore, because I know a lot of people were really excited to have siblings. I was not. I loved being the baby, didn't need a baby sister. Now, do I love my baby sister? Absolutely. I do. But I can remember very vividly being a very small child that was like, hey, wait a minute. We don't need this one. We were fine already. So part of me grieves being a baby, but a lot of me grieves this bus. So that was like a double whammy to tell me that this was the episode for now. So that was my magic moment, where these magical pictures jumping out at me. And anyway, I hope that sits well with y'all. Also, before we get started on the episode, I'm going to pull another card. I'm actually going to pull two cards because I missed last week. We had a stomach flu. I had my teeth relined, which then they didn't fit, and I made big sores in my mouth. I have a cold sore. It's just been a freaking week. And so last Monday, I was like, you know what? I am just going to let it slide, and I will slide in next Monday with episode 8, and we'll just have a week off. So that's what we did. We had a week off. So I will draw two cards from the Seasons of the Witch Imbolc Oracle. It is by Lorraine Anderson and Juliet Diaz. I will leave a link to the deck in the show notes also. Let me write that down. Deck. If I don't write it down, I don't remember. And then sometimes I don't have time to listen to these before I actually publish them. So I will remember to put a link in. I just got the other day the new Ostara Oracle. It is the last deck in the series, and it is our next holiday. So I'm super excited. I will start working with it very shortly, but I'm so stoked. It's this beautiful peach color. Like, this is this gorgeous blue. This one is peach, and it has kind of like this silver peach lavender foiling on the edge. It's very ethereal. It's very springy. I love it. It's fantastic. But let's see what the Imbolc Oracle has for us today. The first card is River Rocks. It says, go with the current, dear one. Find peace in letting go. Let life wash over your soul and welcome your becoming. So that's our first one. Let's see what our second one's going to be. Our second one is Weather Divination. I trust in what I feel, for what I feel are signs to pay mind. All right, so let me get the book and we'll see what the book has to say about these two. First one we pulled, which would have been for last week, is River Rocks. The keywords for River Rocks are going with the flow, finding peace, and washing away the old. On the card, there is a picture of a woman standing beside a kind of a gray river, and she has rocks stacked up around her. She has some candles lit. It looks like there is a fox or a coyote in the background, and the moon is almost full, or had just been full, but not quite full at the moment. And everything's blanketed in this wonderful snow, and all of the trees and bushes look bare and full of just a wintry feeling. A river rock has no choice where it goes. Water washes it along the banks, or perhaps a stranger picks it up and throws it in the deep to sink to the bottom. Wherever the rock lands, it has ended up where it was supposed to be. And when drawing this card, you too are experiencing something your soul signed up for long before your time on earth. There isn't much you can do to change the outcome of your situation, so you are being guided to go with the flow and let river rocks fall where they may. This card will generally come to you during times of disappointment, and I suggest you are only seeing what you've lost. You may not yet know the silver lining of your situation. So focus on finding peace where you are rather than try to create a different outcome. Additionally, if you are receiving this card because you are having a hard time letting go of the past, it's time to wash away what was, or you'll miss the beauty and joy of your new surroundings. So going with the flow, finding peace, washing away the old, letting go. I like that. I like that. Now let's see what weather divination has for this next week. Weather divination keywords are focus, paying attention, interpreting signs, and trusting what you feel. And the picture of the card is like this woman in deep divination, twisted over backwards, almost like she's doing a back bend. And there's breath or smoke coming out of her mouth with words. And there is a white bird sitting on top of her. It looks like a crow, but it looks like a white crow. And there is another wolf or coyote type creature. And there are candles lit around her, but it also kind of looks like she's standing on ice. And there's a crescent moon in the background with a couple of almost looks like islands, but kind of like mountainous islands, kind of rocky islands. So let's see what the book has to say. Divination rarely, if ever, delivers clear-cut signs. So it's up to you to learn how to piece things together to tell the most accurate story. This is something to be learned over time, of course, but it's also an innate gift you must possess so you have the confidence to know what is right or wrong. This card suggests the need to watch your situation closely, knowing others are watching you just as intently. You are likely experiencing many moving parts that require a great deal of focus and attention. Many things may fall through the cracks in the coming weeks if you aren't careful. You may need to give a little extra effort for a time until things settle down. But just as with divination, you need some room to release perfectionism. Do the best you can while understanding that mistakes are unavoidable. Others will respect your efforts as long as you are honest and willing to acknowledge you may not have all the answers. If you're worried about how your situation will play out, drawing this card means there isn't a clear answer just yet. Trust that if something feels off, then it probably is. All right, I like that for going into the next week. Let's keep that in mind. Let's focus, pay attention. Let's see the signs that the universe is giving to us. And trust what you feel about those signs. Know that you already know because you do already know. So I hope those cards give you some insight over the next week or so. But now let's get started on grief. I call this episode The Magical Gift of Grief because as hard as grief is and as hard as loss is, it really is a magical gift. And so whether you have lost a spouse or a parent or a sibling or a child, grief is going to look really different depending on what type of grief it is that you're grieving. And so as we go through this episode, I ask you to keep an open mind. And we're going to go over some of the positive things first, just to kind of set a happier tone for what is kind of a somber situation and conversation. So one of the gifts that grief gives us is it forces us to confront our own mortality. And that may not sound like a gift, but a lot of times when we're forced to confront our own mortality, we find more magic in life. We find more sweetness. You know, the berries are sweeter, the sun is brighter, everything is just a little bit better. And that's good. That's a good thing. Grief also helps us deeply appreciate the love we shared with the person or the situation that we have lost. We're going to talk a lot about grief being in relation to people, but remember, it's not always a person that you've lost. You could have lost a job, you could have lost a home, you could have just, lost a friend. We can grieve losing anything, and grief is funny like that. It's like the last episode about love magic. Grief is one of the strongest forms of love. And so there's a lot of magic in it. And I just hope, regardless of what kind of loss that you've had, that you can find some magic in that grief. Another gift that grief can give us is it can lead to personal growth by prompting us to reevaluate our priorities. There is nothing more confronting than losing someone that you love, for you to be like, oh, wait a minute. What am I doing? Is this what I even want to do? Is this me? Is this who I want to be? Is this the life I want to live? Whatever you are not changing, you are accepting. So when we look at what we're accepting, if that isn't aligned to where we want to be, then we need to change something. So losing something can help us grow personally and reevaluate what is it that we're doing? Why? Do we like this? Do we not like this? Think about it. Another gift that grief gives us is it helps us develop greater empathy. Empathy is another very, very pure form of love. Empathy is being able to feel what someone else is feeling and relate to them without having to compete with it. No one has to have bigger grief than you. No, we can all just be empathetic to each other and be understanding a little bit easier when we're going through it, or when we have gone through it ourselves. I know that before I had a lot of loss in my life, I probably was not as empathetic as I am now. Now I hear of people losing, a parent or a loved one, whoever, and I'm just like, oh man, I'm so sorry that you're feeling like this. I feel genuinely for them, because I've been there. It's not fun. It's not easy, and it's not quick. But another gift that grief can give us is it can help us find new meaning in life. So when you reevaluate and you decide, hey, wait a minute, this isn't what I want to do. This isn't who I am. This doesn't represent what I want out of life. Then we have the opportunity to change it and to find the new meaning in our life and find out what it is that means the most to us. Essentially, grief can be a catalyst for deeper self-awareness and renewed perspective of life's preciousness. And that is so freaking true, man. Every day is so precious. Every day, whether it is a day that we get lots of things done, whether it's a day that we feel busy and rushed, whether it's a day, whatever day it is precious. And the more we can be grateful for that sacred preciousness, the more we can really start to see it every day and even appreciate the stuff that sucks, because we're still here. Even though something might suck, at least we're here doing it, doing the thing, living the life. So some of the key aspects of how grief can be a gift is, the first one here is acknowledgement of love. Experiencing grief signifies the depths of love you had for the person who passed away, reminding you of the positive memories and enriching experiences that you shared. I love trying to acknowledge the love that I have felt for the people that I have lost. Sometimes it has been a struggle, depending on who it was. But when you can focus on those positive memories and those enriching experiences, you're going to feel a whole lot better because you're acknowledging the positive part of the love that you had for them. As we just discussed a second, increased empathy. Increased empathy makes you more understanding and compassionate towards others, and you also gain an insight into their pain. When you experience pain, it's easier to see that pain in other people. Sometimes it's not an outward, hysterical pain. Sometimes it's a pain behind their eyes, if that makes sense. You can just see behind their eyes that they're dealing with something very heavy. And when you see that, you are more able to recognize it and empathize with that person. We talked about reevaluating priorities. The realization of life's finiteness that comes with grief can lead to a reassessment of what truly matters in life, prompting you to focus on meaningful relationships and experiences. A lot of times when we lose someone and we started reevaluating, one of the things that I think is most important to reevaluate is time, because time is one of the resources that we cannot make more of. We can grow more food, we can make more money, we can make more friends, but we cannot, as hard as we want to, make time. So when we reevaluate the time, maybe we realize we're spending time with people that are sucking the fucking life out of us. Maybe you don't need that person in your life. Maybe you don't need those people in your life. When you reevaluate your time, you can be more intentional with your time and use your time for what it is you want to use your time for. We did an episode about boundaries a couple weeks ago. That's another thing, that when you reevaluate your priorities, your boundaries may change dramatically. And that's hard. It's really hard, but it's so important to set those boundaries so that you are setting yourself up for good self-care habits, good self-love habits, and going into the next one of personal growth. Having boundaries is a huge step in personal growth. But when we face personal growth by navigating the challenges of grief, you can develop resilience, coping mechanisms, healthy coping mechanisms. Let's go there. We don't want to adopt unhealthy coping mechanisms. Don't get me wrong. I have turned to unhealthy coping mechanisms many times throughout my life in grief. Depending on what age I was, the more destructive they might have been. But developing healthy coping mechanisms is a huge part of personal growth. But navigating grief also helps you have a stronger sense of yourself. By doing that inventory and that reevaluation of what you are wanting out of life, you're going to know more of who you are, because you're like, hey, wait a minute. This is not who I am. This is who I am. This is not what I want to do. This is what I want to do. And that stronger sense of self is one of the biggest indicators of personal growth that you can achieve, is really, really being confident with who you are. Navigating grief also helps improve your connection to others. Sharing grief with loved ones can strengthen bonds and create a supportive community. Now, sometimes that's your family. I'm going to be honest. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and every time we know that we're about to lose someone that we love, we are all there. We are all together, and we walk through that next portal together as a unit, as a family. And I am so grateful for that. I know that not everybody has that in their life. So it could be sharing grief with your friends. It could be sharing grief with a close coworker. Whatever it takes to make that connection with other people, that's what's important. It helps fosters more connections. It's super important to remember that grief is a very complex process. And while grief can lead to positive outcomes, it is important to acknowledge the intense pain and emotional turmoil that it can bring. Intense pain. The emotional pain of grief can be so intense that it causes physical pain. And if we hold on to it too long and we don't work through it, it will manifest into illness. It will manifest into chronic illness, into disease, because our bodies are not meant to stay in grief forever. But in order to work through that grief, we have to have that connection with others. We have to have that personal growth. We have to have the ability to look at it and not move past it, but move through it, because you're never going to be over grief. Grief doesn't just stop, it just fucking changes. And it changes in ways you will never expect completely. Also, it is so important to remember, I said this at the very beginning of the episode, seek support. If you are struggling with grief, seeking professional help or connecting with support groups can be super duper beneficial. I know that not typically is grief associated with divorce. I guess a lot of people, I mean, maybe they think of grief as that. But even though I 100% wanted my divorce, I still grieved the loss of my marriage. And so when I was going through the divorce from my first husband, I went to a divorce recovery group at our church. And I felt really out of place because I was in my late 20s and everyone else was in their late 40s and 50s. And now that I'm 46, I completely understand why there were people in their late 40s and early 50s in divorce recovery. But I was the only person that was young, which made me grieve my marriage even more because we did have a child together. And I felt like I didn't feel like I gave up too soon. That's not at all. I threw in the towel long after the towel should have been thrown in. But it didn't mean that I didn't grieve it. And because I was the only young person in there, it made me feel like more of a failure and it made me grieve it even more. Not to the point that I necessarily wanted to be back with him, but just, you know, enough to really, really fuck with my head. So seek support. I started going to therapy, seeing a psychiatrist, and going to that divorce recovery support group all within a couple of months of each other. And I'm glad I did because it helped me navigate my mental wellness in a healthier way. But there is no shame in seeking help, period, whether that be groups or whether that be medication. Whatever it takes to make you a better you, that's what you need to do. Always, always take care of you first and foremost. Not everyone experiences grief the same way. And grief can come from as many different kinds of loss, not just a death. For example, I talked about my divorce. I really did. I grieved the loss of my marriage, the marriage that I wanted, the marriage that I thought could happen. It sucks. You can grieve the loss of a home. I remember when I was a youngish child, when I was in first grade, we moved to what I would call was my mom's dream home. And we had a couple of wonderful, wonderful years in that home. And then my dad lost his job and we ended up having to sell the home. And I remember as a child knowing that the pain of that loss was palpable. But other than me having to sell my pony, I did not really on any level grieve the loss of that home because I was still with my family. We still had a place to live. There were still enough constants that were stable in my life that as a child, it didn't feel like I was grieving that house. Now, I did grieve that house over the next decade in different ways, especially when some friends of ours moved into that house and I would have to go to birthday parties there. And then, at that point, I was a little bit older and realized, hey, wait a minute, this was a really special place to us and it's not our place anymore. But more recently, when we moved to Colorado, we moved up here with all of the kids plus 2 extra kids. And we had a huge house that we honestly only paid $100 more for than the house we're in now. And the house we're in here now is 1/3, if not 1/4 of the size of the Remington house. And we knew that something was going to happen with that house because they started fixing it up. And typically when they start fixing up a rental, it's not so the rental people can have a great house, it's so they can sell the house. And that's exactly what happened. And they did come to us first and offer if we would like to put an offer on the house first, but we were not able to at that time. And we had a little over 30 days to find somewhere else to live and move. I have never grieved a house more than I did that house. And even though we didn't own it, we just rented it. We knew it wasn't going to be forever. We had already been there 2 years, and it was a perfect house for us. Now, in retrospect, I now know why the universe played its cards that way, and I can be grateful for that. But it didn't mean that I was not in active mourning for that house whenever we left it. It took everything I had to get up and get moved and take care of the kids and go to work and keep on trucking because I wanted to just lay on the floor and cry. So, like I said, it doesn't just have to be the loss of a person. I miss that home. I grieve that home. I still drive. It took me over a year to be able to drive by the home and not cry. I drove by it this morning on the way to Sam's, and I was really proud of me because I'm not in that place of grief about that home anymore. But when I was, it would physically assault me when I drove past it. Another thing that is very common, and I want to say it out loud, I don't think as women we talk about this enough, but the loss of an infant as far as like miscarriage or maybe just not being able to get pregnant, infertility, that loss of what feels like to you is your femininity, your ability to make children, your ability to procreate. When you don't have that, you grieve. And when you get pregnant and lose a baby once, twice, 10 times, it doesn't get any easier at all. It rips your heart out every time because you knew you were growing a little life inside of you, and then the next thing you weren't. I have type O negative blood, which is a great gift to the world, and I try to donate pretty regularly. It doesn't make for great making babies. Your body attacks the fetus and you miscarry. I've dealt with more miscarriages than I probably even actually know because at some point in my life, I just convinced myself that I was late and that was it. And even though it seemed like it probably was more than just a regular menstrual cycle, I was young and in my head, I was just telling myself that I was just late. It wasn't that I was miscarrying. Um, your job, your career, huge, huge loss. The last job that I had that someone else, wrote me a check once a month for my wages. I worked with special needs students in the public school setting. And when I left that, it broke me. It broke me before I left it, but it broke me when I left it in a different way. And when I left, what broke me the most was running into one of my former students and then be like, Miss Bright, where you been? You my teacher. Why are you not my teacher anymore? I bawled in the middle of Walmart because one of my students came up and said just that to me. Big hug, big smile, then a frowny face. Where you been? Why are you not here for me? I grieved that job. I grieved that job so much that I started a nonprofit so that I can go help those students and make a living without having to do the things that I was forced to do while I was at that job. Because that's how much losing that job made me grieve. Those students meant the world to me. They mean the world to me. And running into one of them in public and then thinking that I abandoned them, that I left them, it still pulls on my heartstrings. It really does. I don't think no matter how many hours I volunteer, I don't think that feeling will ever go away because I can't help every single student that I ever had. It's not possible. And I do what I can and I love it, but it doesn't make that grief doesn't make it go away. Like I said, you don't move past it, you move through it. And you're always in it. Just depends on what phase. Something else that could cause great grief is illness or injury or other health changes. You cannot tell me that my mom did not grieve when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. You cannot tell me that my dad did not grieve when he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, especially when they started giving him the statistics. Esophageal cancer, if you Google it, it's not have the greatest statistics at all. And with the amount of esophagus and stomach that they had to take out of my dad, we were looking at like fighting odds of like 10 to 20%. Like, this is a really, really hard thing to get past. And it was very, very hard. But it could be as simple as something like mono. Mono sticks around for a while. Pneumonia sticks around for a while. They can make you grieve your health that you had before you were ill. Financial stability. If you are financially stable and you lose that, there is grief involved. You grieve being able to go to the grocery store and be like, hey, cool, let's just buy some groceries, not counting every single dime and feeling like a social reject when you have to call over the checker to have them change the price by $2 because it was on sale for $2 less, and it literally makes that big of a difference in your budget that you need that $2 because that $2 is paying for something else. Losing that, there's a lot of grief. There's a lot of grief in that. Losing a friend or a change in friendships. I know sometimes the seasons of our life change, and sometimes there's a handful of people that are with us for a shorter period of time, and then they're not. And there's a reason for that. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, especially when with changing jobs. When I left my job at the school, I grieved the friends that I did not see anymore because they were such a great part of my life. And it's not their fault that I was put in the position I was put in. But now, everyone's busy. Life is busy. It is what it is. They're not the people that I see every day anymore. And I grieve that. I do grieve that. And, whether it's a move or a change in schedule, or maybe someone had a baby, or maybe someone lost a spouse, or, there's all kinds of ways that friendships change. And it's okay to grieve the loss of that friendship when you feel like there's something that you've lost. The last one I'm going to bring up that's very easy to feel grief over, which I haven't experienced yet. In fact, I may never experience it, because at this rate, we're both going to have to work until the day we die. But retirement. For many, many, many people, by the time you get to retire, one, it's scary, because did you save enough? In this market, there's just really no telling if you're going to have enough money saved, and that's scary. But just grieving your youth, grieving the fact that you used to get up and go to work every day, and now you don't have to, which is great at first. But, after a while, maybe you start to feel like you're not contributing, or you're not, doing enough stuff with your time. And retirement can be a period of grief for things that are just maybe more unexpected. You don't think you miss that job until you don't go do it every day. You don't think you miss that commute until you're not driving it every day. So, like I said, not one that I have experienced yet. That's the only one. All the rest of them I've experienced. I have some personal knowledge on. Do not have personal knowledge on retirement, but I can imagine that it combines financial security and loss of job and loss of friends all together at the same time, because that's what retirement can mean in a lot of ways. So that is that. So now that we've kind of talked about some of the good things about grief and some of the not so greatest things about grief, we're going to talk about the different types of grief. And I hope that if you are someone that is dealing with grief, or has dealt with grief, or is possibly looking at impending grief, like maybe you're going to lose a loved one, or you're going to lose your job, or something like that, go through with me as we go through this, and take note as to the different types of grief, because just as there's stages of grief, there's different types. And I'm not going to go through the stages of grief. You're more than welcome to Google that if you want. I'll put a link for the stages of grief in the show notes. There's great books on it. Important. But we're not going to go through that, because that's a whole nother couple of episodes. But we're going to talk about different types of grief. So the first type of grief we're going to talk about is normal grief. But that's a trick question, sort of, because there is no such thing as normal grief. Yes, there are commonalities in the symptoms of grief, but everyone processes grief in their own way. Now, some of the commonalities of grief are sadness, insomnia, lack of appetite, depression, anger, numbness, overeating, sleeping excessively, and the lack of the will to live. Those are pretty, not only intense symptoms, but sometimes conflicting. Do you have a lack of appetite, or are you overeating? Maybe both. Are you sad, or are you angry, or are you both? Can you not sleep, or are you sleeping all the time? Or maybe both. So yes, these are all commonalities of grief, but just remember, there's no such thing as normal. Normal is not real when it comes to grief. The only thing normal about grief is that we all experience it at some point. That's the only thing that's normal. As we stated earlier, some people really benefit from support groups. This could be one-on-one support. This could be, actual group support. Some people like one-on-one more because grief is a very private thing, and one-on-one feels a lot more private, especially if you're going to a licensed counselor where you have HIPAA protection. So it is just you and your counselor, or you and your therapist, or you and your psychologist or psychiatrist, or whoever it is. But there's also a great benefit from support groups. Like I said, the divorce recovery group that I was a part of when I was getting divorced, I didn't have any sort of HIPAA protections. And I didn't even really have anything in common with the people that I was in the group with. But I did benefit from having a group. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be for grief. Like mine was for divorce. And, if you are someone that is on the AA or NA journey, that's going to be another group that can really help support you through grief. Seriously, talk to your sponsor. If you don't have a therapist, talk to, a pastor, talk to a friend, talk to a boss, talk to somebody. Just know that there is no shame in talking about your grief. Grief is always associated with the loss or surrender of something, and it always needs to be addressed for us to begin a healing process as we learn to move forward in a new way. Grief is very often a before and after. Before mom died, after mom died. Before I lost my job, after I lost my job. There is a new life and an old life. There is a past life and a future life when it comes to certain kinds of grief. We always feel like there's a loss. We always feel like we've surrendered something, whether that be a loved one or, a situation. But if we do not address it and really address it head on, we can't move forward into that new part, into that new side. So just remember, only thing normal about grief is we all experience it at some point. And from this point forward, there's going to be some different kinds of non-normal grief that we're going to talk about. So the first one that I would call a legitimate type of grief, since we decided that normal is not a legitimate word, is anticipatory grief. This is grief you feel when you know a loss is coming, or you are experiencing a loss, but the full impact of the loss hasn't happened yet. So you're going to lose a job. Your car is going to be repossessed. That your parent is about to die. That is all anticipatory grief. It's also very, very common for anyone who has a terminal illness or diagnosis, or has a loved one that's experiencing a terminal illness or diagnosis. Very common. You can grieve the fact that you are going to die when you know that it is impending. You are anticipating that loss of your own life. But it also is very applicable to your loved ones when you know that they are dealing with something that there is not going to be a positive outcome. It is very, very common to anticipate that grief. And that's still a legitimate form of grief. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean you're not already grieving. Spouses and children of adults with dementia experience powerful anticipatory grief as they watch their loved one's memory and life spirit ebb away. Now, I can remember back when I was a small child, my nanny and papa, from the picture, my nanny and papa had some friends that they were very close with that my mom and her two sisters had grown up with their I think they had two sons. They might have only had one son, but they grew up together in the church. They were, family friends, catfish fries together, going to the Gulf together, eating watermelon in the backyard together. It was just, they were just another part of the family. And they were named Miss Gladys and Mr. Hayden. And Mr. Hayden was the first person in my life that I ever knew of to have Alzheimer's. Now, granted, I was young enough to think that the word was old timers, but Mr. Hayden was the first person that I knew to have Alzheimer's. And I remember everyone having anticipatory grief over that. And that the more his condition progressed, the more that grief grew. And so know that regardless of how well you think someone is going to take a diagnosis or how well you think you're going to process someone else's diagnosis, there is a natural instinct to grieve watching someone decline or watching yourself decline. Very, very, very powerful anticipatory grief. But you can experience anticipatory grief as you put a much loved one into a nursing home. Putting my nanny into a care facility because my mom had passed away and she wasn't there to help take care of her. And I just had a brand new baby and everyone was busy. And so nanny got put in a nursing home. I grieved that. I was grieving the death of my mom. I was grieving the fact that nanny had to move into a home. And it was all anticipatory. It was grieving before the grief even really set in. You can also have anticipatory grief knowing that you have to put a pet down. I don't know many people that don't lose their ever loving shit when they know they're going to have to put their dog down or their cat down, especially if it's some sort of family pet, because you have that knowledge that not only are you going to miss this pet, but that your children are going to miss this pet, that your parents are going to miss this pet. It doesn't get easier. And it doesn't mean that we can't feel that pain before the pain even happens. I hated watching my dad decline, but try to be normal. We have pictures of a few camping trips and holidays of my dad very, very sick, but still trying to be normal. And that was so hard. That was so hard to watch him keep trucking when we were watching him wither away. So just know that you can grieve before there's even something that people may say you have to grieve. The next one is complicated grief. And it is complicated, duh. But it is also diagnosable. So if you are showing grief for over a period of 12 months, the DSM-5, I think we're on now. I said V, honestly, sorry. I think we're on 5. I'm going to be honest. It's been since 4 that I was in school and owned one. But I know that it is diagnosable and you can get, approved treatment through your insurance with the diagnosis. So once again, if you feel like you might be experiencing any of what we're about to talk about and associated with complicated grief, talk to your doctor, talk to your therapist, talk to someone that can help get you diagnosed so that you can get the help that you need to work through complicated grief. Complicated grief is when people are so deep in their grief that they cannot function in their daily life. Someone experiencing complicated grief may avoid anything and everything that reminds them of their loss. I'm going to tell you right now, a lot of times complicated grief pops up when you have more than one loss. So this is the first time I've laid this out, but I will lay this out as best I can in a short period of time. First, I had loss of my divorce. We talked about that. Then not long after I divorced, my ex-husband OD'd and died. So I had to deal with the loss of our marriage, the loss of him physically on this earth. Even though he wasn't the greatest dad, he was trying to be a better dad. He was trying to do the right thing. And that's when he died. Then about a month after he died, my dad died. And then the next year, one of my child's loves died. And then one of my other child's best friend's brother died. And then my mom died. And then my grandmother died. And so by, like the fourth or fifth loss, I was so deep in complicated grief that I wish I would have known that it was something that is diagnosable and treatable and that there is coverage for it. But one of the ways that I definitely would avoid anything and everything that reminds me of my loss was, we talked about earlier, the not driving past the house. That's one that I've done in my life. But more importantly, it took me over a year to be able to drive past my nanny's house. After my mom passed away, Nanny went to go live at a nursing facility, and I could not drive by that house. One, because Nanny wasn't there, and two, because that's where Mom fell before she died. It hurt my soul to even think about driving past that house. And I was elbow deep in complicated grief. Now I know this. At the time, I did not. Complicated grief can also cause irrational thoughts. By the time I lost Mom, I had a lot of irrational thoughts. I'd already gone through several losses before that, but because Mom's was so sudden, in case you don't know the story, my mom was watching my kids on a Friday night while we took our other kids to Fort Worth to their bio mom so she could see them for the weekend. So Daniel and I went, I was pregnant with Zeke. Daniel and I went with Drew and Becca to go meet their mom. And Abby and Clara were at Nanny's house with Ninny and Nanny. So Ninny and Nanny were there, and Clara was playing in the backyard in a little water hose. And my mom tripped over the water hose and hit her head on the cement patio and had to be careful. I did to Fort Worth, went into a coma for 6 days. And then we turned off the machines and let her pass. And so it was very unexpected. It was very sudden. It happened very quickly. It was one of those, once things started declining, they never started looking any better. And that was already after all the other losses. So irrational thoughts were very rampant at our house, not just me, but my kids also. So it is super, super important to seek therapy, preferably with a licensed grief counselor. That was something I learned about whenever Abby was struggling with all the losses that we went through, is that therapy is great, counseling is great, but there are licensed grief counselors out there, because grief therapy is a different type of therapy and there's different needs with it. So if you can find a grief counselor, please, 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 please And know that it is very possible that you might need meds to begin processing grief. And there is nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. Speak to your doctors. Speak constantly, consistently, and honestly. Because if you get put on a med and it's not working for you, you need to let them know. If it's making you feel worse, you need to let them know immediately. A lot of meds for depression and for grief have the side effect of suicidal thoughts. And that's the last thing you need when you're already feeling so fucking low, is to have a medication that is making your irrational thoughts more irrational. So communication and honesty is fucking key. I'm going to say it with a big fucking. Be honest, be real, be communicative, talk about it, talk about how you feel, talk about your needs, and not just with your doctors, with your friends, with your loved ones, with anyone that you feel safe with. So that's complicated grief. Next is disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is grief that is not openly acknowledged or supported by society. Our culture struggles to help each other process grief associated with atypical losses. So a lot of times you may be feeling loss over something that someone else doesn't think is that big of a deal. Just because they don't think it's a big deal doesn't mean that you don't feel like you've lost something. So just because they think you should be over it doesn't mean that it's not valid. Another thing that goes along with this is that a lot of times people act like you're supposed to get over it really quick. Like a typical, if you even get it, a typical bereavement leave is only 5 days. How in the fuck are you supposed to get over the death of a loved one in 5 days? And that's 5 days usually if it is a spouse or a child. You don't even usually get 5 days if it's a parent. So you're supposed to get over the loss of a spouse or a child in 5 days. It's not possible. It just isn't. You can't even get done all the things that you need to get done in 5 days. I think it took 9 weeks to get the death certificate whenever Charlie passed. I thank baby Jesus that I did not have to deal with any of that stuff with my parents. My brother, Frank, took care of all of that with dad and with mom. And I only barely had to deal with it with Charlie. It was still a lot, and it still is nothing that can be taken care of in 5 days. People will often say or think, it's been months. Why aren't you over this yet? Honestly, it takes months to do all the things associated with someone's death. It takes months to get the death certificate. It takes months to deal with if there's any insurance, life policies. It takes months to deal with Social Security if you're dealing with any sort of Social Security benefits. All of it takes a long time. Yet they act like you're supposed to be able to plan a service, clear all their belongings, get a death certificate, get your insurance claims, get Social Security benefits, clearing out any sort of debts or financial situation. All that's supposed to be done in 5 days or, 5 weeks, whatever it is that everybody else deems is an appropriate amount of time to grieve is not your timeline. There is not a timeline that says this is how long grief is supposed to last. You don't move past it, you move through it. So don't let someone else's opinion of what your grief should be to make you feel like it's disenfranchised. It is valid grief. It's valid, period. Regardless if someone else thinks it's valid. If you are feeling it, it's a valid feeling, period. The next type of grief is inhibited grief. This is the griever who stuffs their grief so deep inside that they go about life as if nothing has happened at all. Inhibited grievers are frequently judged by family members or friends because they appear cold or unaffected by the loss. Many type A personalities are inhibited grievers who have learned the art of perpetual busyness to avoid painful emotions. That is true. Many type A's are just too busy to slow down and grieve. But another way that it happens, and this sucks, is when there's a loss of a child. And this goes on with our next type. The next type is called absent grief. And inhibited grief and absent grief are kind of like Siamese twins. A lot of times people have to keep on trucking and pretending like nothing's bothering them when they lose their child, because that loss is so deep that they just don't want to look at it. But not looking at that grief makes you prone to physical ailments such as migraines, nausea, unidentified anxiety, and digestive issues. People that have inhibited grief can become so physically or emotionally exhausted that they become seriously ill. Now, my oldest, I'm going to be real, when we went through all of the period of loss, I think she experienced all of these types. I think she experienced complicated. I think she experienced inhibited. I think she experienced absent at some point. But I can tell you one thing, regardless of how many different types of grief that she went through, her body was wrecked for years. During high school, during all these periods of losses, she was hospitalized multiple times for reasons that never were really apparent. They were always, oh, it must be something viral, was like the answer. By the third time, it had just gotten ridiculous. But in retrospect, I think every single bit of it had to do with her level of stress and how emotional stress does cause physical stress on the body. It's all one. We're all body, heart, and mind. We're all body, soul, and mind. So if our mind and our souls are in a bad place, our bodies are going to be in a bad place. It just makes sense. It's literally how it fucking works. So when you are too busy to slow down and grieve, it's going to catch up with you physically, sometimes before it does emotionally. But it can also cause cancer and chronic illness. It doesn't have to just be unidentified illness. It can cause real illness. When we have dis-ease in our minds and in our souls, we have disease in our body. So remember that. It's all about getting our body, mind, and soul all together in the same place where they can thrive. If something's not thriving, something's not jiving. That's just it. Inhibited grief in a marriage can lead to divorce. If you lose a child and one parent is grieving that loss and one person is avoiding that loss, it can lead to divorce quick. Parents of deceased children are more likely to get divorced than if one of them has a terminal illness or cancer, or if they lose a parent. It is one of the most common reasons for divorce is child loss. It's hard. And it's especially hard if somebody is trying to keep on trucking without dealing with it. Can also lead to compromised relationships with your own children. When you are not grieving, they see someone not dealing with the emotions, not dealing with the trauma, not dealing with the sadness. And then they feel all those things inside of them, but they're like, why doesn't mom feel those things? And then it makes them doubt themselves. And it just makes for a breakdown in the relationship that you have with your own children. So don't let losing your parent also make you lose your child because you're not dealing with the real emotions that are associated with it. And last but not least, it can lead to a nervous breakdown. It is either going to catch up with you mentally or physically, one or the other. It is going to. That could be a mental breakdown. That could be cancer or anywhere in between. We can't just busy our way through the grief. We have to walk through the fire to be able to get to that new side of life. Now, this isn't the last one. This is the second to last one. Oh no, it's not, third to last. The next type of grief is absent grief. Absent grief is a stage of complete denial. It is when someone simply does not want to accept what actually happened or that the person who died is actually dead. People experiencing absent grief are themselves in every other way, but can seem absolutely insane to those who know them. When the griever constantly refuses to acknowledge the death of a loved one. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with someone that is not even accepting the fact that this person has passed, or this job has passed, or this home has passed, whatever it is? Once again, these griefs can be for anything. We just typically talk about them in the sense of losing a loved one because that's the most typical type of grief. Absent grief is often found just as inhibited grief is with the loss of a child. There are people that still get up and wash their kids' laundry and make their kid breakfast and go about normal life just as if they're there, even though they aren't, because that is how hard processing losing a child is. And also be very common with losing a spouse. Some people may even pretend that that person is still alive. It happens. It is most common for those who've experienced a sudden or shocking loss. Horrible example that no one ever wants to think about is a child suicide. Very, very common for absent grief to be present in a child suicide because that is such a hard trauma to navigate that, I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. If that happened to me, which there were points in our life that we were afraid that we could be parents of a child suicide, I think I might go into straight denial also. I am definitely not judging. I can understand why it would be something that your mind would slip into because of all of the trauma and loss around losing a child, period, much less than taking their own life. It just adds an exponential amount of trauma and grief to the situation. Now, after absent grief, the next type is exaggerated grief. This is when someone experiences more intense reactions to loss than what's typical. Though remember at the beginning, we said that, really what is typical? Typical is a spectrum. But when someone is experiencing exaggerated grief, they can experience overwhelming sorrow and absolutely cannot rise out of it. Those who experience exaggerated grief often suffer multiple significant losses in a short amount of time. Exaggerated grief is also very commonly leads to self-destructive behaviors, suicidal thoughts, guilt, substance abuse, isolation, chronic depression, and numbness. People experiencing exaggerated grief often need more support than other people. Their feelings may seem exaggerated to you, but they don't feel exaggerated to them. They feel very genuine to them. And when grief is so overwhelming that it's leading to suicidal thoughts and substance abuse and self-destructive behaviors and isolation and numbness and guilt, you're definitely going to need more support. Exaggerated grief is also often present when involving a suicide or a homicide. Like I said, suicide exacerbates that trauma experience and that trauma reaction. Homicide, the same way. Nobody wants their loved one to be murdered. It just adds to it. So just know that when someone is experiencing exaggerated grief, that, you know, they may have experienced multiple things in a short amount of time. They may have just experienced one thing that was very, very, very traumatic. It can be either or somewhere in between. But please, please, if you know someone that is experiencing it, or if you think that someone is just super extra, maybe you don't even recognize it as exaggerated grief. Maybe you just think that person is being a bit fucking much. Encourage them to seek help, because I promise grief is very rarely something that people over exaggerate just because they want attention. There are other things people may over exaggerate for attention, but in my experience, grief is not one of the most typical things that people exaggerate. If someone feels exaggerated in grief, it is because they are fucking overwhelmed and they need support and help. So please, please encourage them for support and help. The last one, the last type of grief is delayed grief. Delayed grief is common for someone who began their grief journey in the absent or inhibited group of grief. When they wake up or respond to their feelings, it is because they have become impossible to ignore. This is experiencing delayed grief. So when you're absent or inhibited at first, delayed grief is going to happen. All of those emotions they've repressed come roaring up as if the loss happened yesterday, because they have put a wall up and they have blocked it off. It does feel just as raw as if it had just happened. Just happened. So don't think that there's something wrong with someone just because they feel like it just happened. They may have been pushing away those feelings for a very long time. Weeks, months, even years. There's no timeline on it. It's just when it hits, it hits. It is common for those who've experienced a series of losses, which a lot of these are related to that. And often it is very beneficial for delayed grievers to do something physical to honor the grief that they have repressed. So say other people are kind of grieving on a more non-repressed or non-inhibited or non-absent. They're more in the active stage of grieving. They may have gotten something out of a memorial service or a funeral. They may have gotten something out of spreading someone's ashes. They may have gotten something out of spending time with loved ones during, this period of grief following the passing. But if you're absent in that grief, or you're having an inhibited experience of that grief, you may have not gotten anything out of any of those situations. You may not even actually remember the funeral or the memorial service or whatever it is that you did to memorialize or celebrate that person's life. So because they did not get any sort of therapeutic value out of those experiences and situations, it is beneficial to do something physical to help honor that person. For example, plant a tree. You're starting a new life in this tree. It can be representative of that person. And as that, especially if it's a child, I love planting trees for children because it gives you a physical representation of that child growing up on this earth, but just as a tree. And if the person was cremated, you could put some ashes with the tree. Or maybe if you are allowed, depending on the cemetery or, wherever the memorial land that they are buried at, sometimes you can plant a tree there by the plot. And then you can visit it and watch it grow as your love had grown for that person. If they won't let you plant a tree, dedicating a stone or a bench is another option, possibly. I watch a lot of true crime, and the other night I was watching one, and they did not get to bring their loved one's body home. And so they didn't have like a grave to go visit. They didn't have ashes to keep in something special or dedicate, sprinkle somewhere. So what they did is they made a spot in their yard, and they made a bench, and they had little like metal butterflies that like stick in the ground. And they saw their son that had been murdered as a butterfly. And they planted, milkweed and different plants that they would like, that butterflies would like. And so they made like a butterfly garden on their own property so that they could go and sit and commune with the spirit of their son. And I thought that was really, really, really cool. And it doesn't have to be a stone or a bench or a tree. It can be anything that memorializes or physically connects you to the person that you lost. That really helps with delayed grief. Delayed grief is also more common to those who experience the loss in the midst of an immediate life change. So like, say you lose your dad in the middle of a divorce, or you lose someone after you just lost a job. It doesn't even have to be a negative life change. I'm going to tell you right now, I was pregnant with Clara when my dad died, and I was pregnant with Zeke when my mom died. I was already in the middle of a huge immediate life change when I lost each of my parents. I do think I had some delayed grief because I had to keep my shit together because I was growing a baby inside of me. And I had 3 other children that I was raising and had to make sure that they were mentally stable and that they were succeeding at school and that they were taken care of. I think that definitely affected how I grieved the loss of them, especially while I was pregnant. And then it also changed how I felt after I had each of the babies. I felt a great amount of grief over my dad never meeting either one of them. And I felt an immense amount of grief with mom never meeting Zeke. Mom didn't even know that Zeke was going to be a boy. She never knew that I was going to finally have my baby boy. So yeah, delayed grief, it happens, and it happens when you don't want it to happen. Overall, the key to working with different types of grief is to recognize that you are grieving, regardless of what type of grief it is, regardless of what it looks like. You have to recognize that you're grieving, and you have to be able to work with that grief. There's all kinds of resources for grief. As we talked about earlier, there's live one-on-one grief counseling. There's support groups. You can find them online. You can talk to therapists online through texting now. Look into your insurance, see what your insurance covers, what you can access. But there's a lot of either via telemed or via text med options. If you can't make it, I know when I was trying to go to therapy, they didn't have appointments available in the evening. So how do you work a job, raise children, get them to school, get yourself, a paycheck, and also make time for a therapist, especially if they're only seeing people from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Like, it just doesn't work. So look into other options. Look into traditional therapy. It may work for you. It may be available for you. You may be in an area that it works for you. And I hope it does. I hope everyone that listens to this has accessible mental health care, because it is so important. But if you do not have in-person physical mental health care, seek it online, seek it through an app. Just fucking seek it. There's also tons of books on losing a parent, books on dealing with a parent with terminal illness, books on losing a child, books on losing a spouse, books on losing a job, books on losing a home. There is a book on everything. I'm a big proponent of public libraries. I also learned that our public libraries are shrinking by the day in physical book form, but they are growing by the day in digital book form. And there's a lot of different apps that you can access through your public library that have audiobooks, that have ebooks, that have lectures, that have all kinds of digital accessible information to help you journey through your grief. There is no reason why you can't find something to help for absolutely for free. Online grief support is out there. And you will be surprised that having a grief ritual to help you process whatever it is will really help. There's a reason that humans have been ritualizing the burial of their dead for fucking tens of thousands of years. Because we grieve, because we mourn, because having that service, having that memorial, having that important object, whatever it is helps us move through the grief. So keep that in mind. Now we're finally going to bring some magic into this. Talk about some different rituals that you can do to help with grief. One thing that I noticed that I did without even really noticing that I did it was making an altar. Now, an altar can include items owned by the person that you lost, or items that just represent them to you. I have little altars everywhere. I have little shelves that have, like, I have a shelf right over here next to me that has a big jar of buttons that was my nanny's jar of buttons. Buttons are special to me because when I was little, I always wanted to sew with my nanny, and my nanny taught me to sew. I was sewing by myself, full-fledged dresses, costumes, skirts, the whole shebang by 12 years old. But before I ever got on the sewing machine, I would spend hours and hours every summer playing with these jars of buttons and containers of buttons. You know how, like, you never know what's in grandma's cookie tin, those blue cookie tins that have the butter cookies? My nanny's, she had buttons in hers, buttons and zippers. And so I keep that jar of buttons where I see it every day because I know that she's with me. And I know that if I'm sad, I can reach in and pull out a button, and it's like carrying a little piece of nanny around with me. So I have buttons and I have a little corn. It looks like a cob of corn with the husk still kind of halfway on it. And she always had Vaseline brand intensive therapy lotion in it. It's got that smell. And that's what I have in it right now. It kind of has a strange yellow tinge to it. But I have like this whole little nanny section right next to me with a little wooden cutout that says be happy. It really should say be patient, because those were nanny's, that was nanny's dying words to me, were Jamie, be patient with those kids. And that's what those buttons are to me. They're my nanny telling me the things that my nanny told me, even when she's not here to physically tell me. Now, when you find a place that you would like to make an altar, or an altar type honoring shelf, with some people are not comfortable with the word altar. You don't have to use the word altar. You could say it's a memory box, a shadow box, a memory shelf, whatever you want to call it. The word doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. But something you might want to do is light a black candle, because black candles are good for banishing bad energy, but they're also a very powerful healer. And when you light that candle, it could also be a white candle, also great for cleansing. And great, white candles are great for everything, just like clear quartz. It rocks. But light whatever fucking color candle you want and look into the flame while you ruminate about your loved one. Look at the items, touch the items, feel the items that remind you of your loved one, and think about all those wonderful memories, all those times that you had with them. I like to keep journals. I write in crap all the time. In fact, I have them everywhere. And I highly, highly suggest, if you did not go to my journaling workshop, these $1 to 10-cent little composition books, they're the best. Because you know what? Nobody's afraid to write in one of these. These are very easy to write in because they're very cheap. I know lots of people, including myself. In fact, I'm trying to see if I have any behind me. There's at least one on that top shelf and one over here too. There are fancy journals that I never, ever write in, because you don't want to mess it up until you don't write in it. So I get these after, like, say end of September, they're clearancing out all the school supplies, or maybe even into August. Let's be real now. Before they move in Christmas, they got to get rid of all the school supplies. Yes, they completely skip over Halloween. That's what I'm saying. I'll get them for 10 cents a piece. I will get a stack of them. I have a drawer right here to my feet that probably has a stack that big of composition notebooks that I paid less than a quarter for. And anytime I need to write something down, I grab one and start writing it. And I have stacks and stacks and stacks of them in my office outside. And I will go through them periodically and be like, oh, wow, I had all kinds of good ideas that day. And it's not really a journal. It's not really, it's just something to write down what's going on in my brain. And by writing it down, it helps me sort through whatever it is. So while you're looking at that flame and ruminating about your loved one, write about them. Write the memories. Write the things you want to remember, or write the things that come in your brain that you are afraid you're not going to remember later, because that happens. Visualize that flame illuminating the way for your loved one to come home to you, to your room, to your side. And then just sit for a while. Now, depending on what size of candle you light, you may want to sit for the whole entirety of it burning. That could be hours, depending on the size of candle. Or maybe you want to get a candle that is that person, and that you spend 1 hour with it a week until it, for a whole year. You can do this any way you want. There's no wrong way. You can light a birthday candle that will be gone in 30 seconds if you just need 30 seconds to think about your mom for a second. Whatever it is, there's not a wrong way to do it. But look at that fire and see it as the spirit of your loved one, and know that they are there with you, and they are there to guide you, and they are there to love you as long as you want them to be there with you, loving you. If you decide to journal, these are some things you might want to consider. What was it about them that stands out to you? What is it that you never said to them? What do you wish you knew about them? What are some of their quirks? What fabric or perfume or color did they love? How did they look when they entered a room? What did they sing to themselves? What is your loveliest memory of them? What did they do to inspire you? What did they love to do? And what mark did they leave when they left this earth? Those are all things that you can journal on or just ruminate on while, your candle is lit. Can also, another ritual that I think is very important is writing a letter. And the great thing about writing a loved one that has passed on a letter is there's no rules. It can be a positive letter. It can be a letter cussing them out. It can deal with emotions like anger and rage. It can deal with forgiveness. It can deal with giving them permission to let go. It can deal with giving yourself permission to let go. There's no wrong way to write a letter to someone who has passed. I had a lot of animosity around my mom's death. A lot of it stemmed from things that were going on when she was alive. And I spent a whole summer writing her letters, nice letters, mean letters, and everything in between. But at the end of that summer, I felt closer to her than I ever did when she was alive. And that really helps me move through a huge part of the grief process, because I had the ability to write down the things I didn't say, to ask the questions I never got to ask. Writing is so therapeutic that if writing them a letter is going to make you feel better, do it. Do it. Another ritual that you can do is you could make a family quilt. You could use fabric that they owned. Like my grandmother, when she passed away, there was a huge thing with fabric in it. Me being the only grandchild that sewed, got all the fabric. And I have boxes of it still to this day. It's been 7 years since she passed, and I still have fabric that I have not done anything with that I would love to make a quilt out of. But one thing that we did do when my dad passed is my mom paid someone to make a t-shirt quilt out of dad's t-shirts. And then all of the different kids got to have the quilt for a certain amount of time. I never got to have the quilt, actually. I don't even know if my siblings know that. I never once got the pawpaw quilt. And I don't even know who has the pawpaw quilt. But somebody has the pawpaw quilt, and it is made out of t-shirts from my dad. Now, I, being the okayest person that I am, have a container of t-shirts that were my mom's that I should have made a quilt out of also. So I have fabric from Nanny and t-shirts from Mom that I definitely should do something with. And hopefully at some point I will. But yeah, make a quilt out of, even if it's just colors of fabric that they like. Maybe it's a style of quilt that they liked. However, you would like to memorialize them in fabric that gives you something tangible that you can cuddle with, or tangible that you can touch and feel and look at and ruminate with. And it's just a really cool ritual. And if you actually sew, it's very therapeutic. It's very therapeutic to put it together, to build it, to go through all those memories of whatever it is that you're using, whether it's the camping trips you went on and bought t-shirts at, or whatever it is, whatever reminds you of them. That's cool. Make a quilt. Other rituals that you can do to help process your grief is celebrate their life at holidays, at their birthday. On their birthday, bake them a cake, or maybe prepare their favorite meal. It is very popular in Celtic tradition to have what's called a dumb supper. And usually people have it around Samhain, around Halloween. Also, the same type of situation. Well, the dumb supper is when you make a full dinner and you set a place for your loved one. You may have a glass of wine or beer or whatever their favorite drink was, and then you make them a plate, and then you sit in silence during this meal and just really honor the love that you have for them. And this can be for all of your ancestors of the past. It can be for one specific person. There's really no wrong way to do this, however you want to. It's very similar to how traditionally for Dias de los Muertos, they have ofrendas. On your ofrenda, you place pictures of your loved ones that have passed and you remember them. And very often they place things like a Coke, if that was their favorite drink, or like for my dad, we put a can of Spam on our ofrenda because Dad loves Spam. I put a jar of cocktail sauce for my mom because I never saw a cocktail shrimp that she's ever turned down in my life. So you can also celebrate with food as they grow. For example, Dad passed away when I was pregnant with Clara, and his last garden, which was done by Mom also, but it was Papa's garden, I saved in the deep freezer little vacuum sealed packages of frozen yellow squash. And when Clara got to eat her first solid foods, her first solid food was Papa's yellow squash. And I felt like I was feeding her a little piece of my dad. I felt like I was nourishing her with food that nourished my dad. So there's lots of different ways that you can celebrate with food and with honoring the people that you love. It doesn't just have to be bake a cake for their birthday. It can be other things. Another thing and another way that you can ritualize the grief and moving through the grief is doing something with your loved one's ashes. Now, if they were not cremated, you could always, like, I have a little cauldron. You can see it if you're watching on YouTube. You can see it right there in the background. I have a little cauldron. I could maybe take those letters that I wrote to my loved one and burn them in the cauldron and then use those ashes if I don't have ashes from them. My parents were both cremated, and so I have ashes for them. But like, I don't have ashes for my nanny. She's buried in Dallas, Texas. So, but if you have ashes, you could spread them in a significant place. When Daniel and I got married, we had been together for 9 years already. And my daddy didn't get to walk me down the aisle. My mom didn't get to help me pick out my wedding dress. But what I did do is I took these little tiny containers, these little tiny glass vials that I got at Hobby Lobby, and I put their ashes in them. And I took a locket and I put a picture of mom and dad on one side and a picture of Nanny on the other side. And I tied that locket in those little tiny jars of ashes on my wedding bouquet. And then after we got married on the side of the mountain, I put the ashes on the side of the mountain, and I gave the little locket to Clara, and Clara cherishes it to this day. But it was significant to me to have them with me, which is why I had them in my bouquet. But it was also significant to me to leave them at that place that means so much to us, and that they get to travel with us. Like, we will, when we go to somewhere new, like if we go to Utah, I will take ashes and we'll dump some in Utah. If we go, wherever we go, I have little containers of ashes of my parents that I take them with us and leave a little bit there. And Frank holds the main ashes. So if we want to go to Texas and get more ashes, I'm sure he'll let me get more ashes. But they currently live on my bedside table, and mom's in a little glass jelly jar and dad is in a little plastic diabetic testing strip container. Not really traditional, but I'm not traditional, so who cares? A lot of people like to carry them in a talisman. You can order, I mean, you can even get them on Temu, from anywhere from James Avery to Temu and in between. You can get little urn necklaces that they don't have to even look like a little urn. Some of them look like, a rose, or I've seen ones that were hummingbirds that I looked at for mom, and ones that were little sailboats that I looked at for dad. So you can put their ashes in a little talisman and carry it around with them. Carry them around with you. You can spread their ashes in the four corners of your property. You can put them in your garden so that you're growing food for your family from the ashes of your loved ones. Another way to memorialize and ritualize them is to keep their name alive. Some go as far as to change their name to their loved ones. To me, that's not for me. I'm not going to name myself Sandy Mae. But naming a new child after them, Zeke is named for my papa Zeke and my dad. His name is Ezekiel Allen. Now, my papa's name wasn't really Zeke, but that's what we call him, and that's what he was called. And my dad's middle name was Allen. And so we used some of my loved ones' names when we had Zeke. So, it doesn't have to be their first name. It could be their middle name. It could be a nickname. However you memorialize that person in that child is going to be meaningful to you. You can also use their name or nickname as one of your computer passwords. You don't have to tell people you're using it as your computer password, obviously. But for example, we have a dog that meant a lot to us. And if you know us, you'll know the name of them. If you don't know us, you're not going to know the name of it. But I'm going to tell you that dog's name is the basis of about 85% of the passwords that belong to me, Daniel, and both two of the older children. They all use this dog's name for part of their password. So that's one way to keep their name alive. You could also start a business or a nonprofit, maybe not using their name, but maybe using something that meant something to them. So however you want to keep their name alive, doing that is a very important ritual to help move through grief. You can also get memorial tattoos. It doesn't have to say mom across you. I don't know if you can see, I have hummingbirds for my mom. My mom was a Gemini, so I have a good hummingbird and an evil hummingbird, and they represent my mom. My mom, hummingbirds have always meant a lot to her, and so those are my mom hummingbirds. I also, you can't see because the shirt I have on, but I have a giant purple octopus on my left arm for my dad. Now, when people see my purple octopus, do they know that that's a memorial tattoo for my dad? No, they don't. But I know that when I was 3.5 years old, that my dad and I played camping and we ate purple octopus toast. And I don't even know what the fuck purple octopus toast is, but that's what we ate. And that's why I have a purple octopus. So it doesn't have to make sense to anyone else. It just has to make sense to you. I happen to be partial to tattoos. I highly recommend everyone getting memorial tattoos, but you don't have to. You can, but just know that it just has to make sense to you. It doesn't have to make sense to anyone else. Another way to help memorialize and ritualize the passing of your loved ones is to give away their riches. Now, I say riches in quotation marks because they may not have a lot of money, and if they did have a lot of money, you may need it. I don't know. But what I mean is, like, when you're ready to go through your loved ones' possessions, don't think of it as a burden. Think of it as a sacred rite of passage. Invite other people to come help you. Don't go through that whole house alone. Have your children come help. Have your siblings come help. Have your best friend come help. Invite people. Light a candle, say a prayer, share memories and stories and laughter and tears. And then as you go through their possessions, give away things of theirs. There's going to be more stuff than you know what to do with. Don't be selfish. Give away their possessions. Give it to the other people that care about them, because everyone grieves in their own way. And I think that everyone really appreciates the ability to have something physical, a trinket, a book, a piece of furniture, whatever it is. Whatever it is that, like this painting, that's a silk screen print of a painting that my grandmother had 4 of them, and I have all 4 of them. There's 2 in front of me, there's 2 behind me. And those were framed art that my nanny had on her wall. Now, is it the kind of art that I would buy? Absolutely not, but I adore them. And my favorite ones are the peacock, which remind me of my nanny, and the chicken, which reminds me of myself, because I fucking love chickens. Chickens are so awesome. Did not know that till I owned chickens. But I also have funny stories that my nanny told me about chickens that she had that got so fat and died. And I love chickens, and they're all different birds, and they're paintings that I love, and they're my jam. I didn't give those away, but I gave away a lot of other stuff that belonged to my parents and to my grandparents. So share those possessions with other people. Know that however you grieve, there's not a wrong way. There's not a right way. There's just a way. There's just a journey, and that is yours and yours alone. So in closing, I want to read you this quote, and I wrote it down on a Post-it because it really, really struck me. Once again, kind of a magic moment when I ran across this quote was when I was getting ready to do this grief episode. But it says, "You are the answer to your ancestors' prayers." And remember that. You are. You are the answer to your ancestors' prayers. Know that you are living a life that makes your ancestors proud. Even if you don't feel like you're living a life to make them proud, you are. You're surviving. You're doing it. You're living this life. You've come a long way. You think about 10,000 years of ancestors all cheering for you at the same time. It kind of feels like you got a spirit team that has your back, because you do. And know that even when you feel like a failure, and even when you feel like you can't go on without them, that you are the answer to their prayers. You are enough. You are loved. You are going to be able to make it without them. So as you go into this next week, be kind to yourself. Remember to Give yourself grace in all forms. Know that sometimes okayest is absolutely okay. And until we moms just keep on making magic. Y'all have a great week. Until next week, I'm out of here. Y'all have a great one.